Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Will Muecke. I am one of the co-founding partners of Artemis Growth Partners. We are a private equity firm focused on impact investing 100% in the global cannabis space. We have about $130 million applied to that thesis currently, continuing to invest beyond that and investing across North America, South and Latin America, looking at Israel and have been investing in Israel, Europe, and our presence here is because we're very interested in Africa.
Awesome. Hi guys, my name is Sibs, full name is Sibusiso Xaba, and I am the co-founder and CEO of ACA Group, which stands for Africa Cannabis Advisory. I previously was an investment banker in the UK for about 8 years, focused on raising capital for African markets, both public and private sector. And I'm originally from Swaziland or Eswatini, and so coming back here, sort of really coming full circle and back to my roots in this the sector that we really want to get off the ground.
My name is David Hess. I am the president and co-founder of Tress Capital. We are a boutique investment firm. We manage investments strictly in the cannabis space for ourselves and our network of high net worth individuals. And I just want to say this is my first time here in Cape Town, and the hospitality has been wonderful. And so thank you all very much.
So I know that our panel title is Difficulties of Investing in Cannabis, and there certainly are difficulties. I think there are difficulties in any industry, and we invested for over a decade in Central America as an impact fund backed by the World Bank and other investors. So we know that difficulties are not constrained to a single industry and certainly not to cannabis. But I think the way that we three panelists really think about that title is maybe we turn it a little bit on its head or we tweak it to say that more we want to focus on both the challenges but also the opportunities in cannabis, which is why we're here. And just jotting this down and speaking amongst the team, we kind of frame the opportunity side, and I think all three of us come from an orientation, as I opened with, around impact. And impact is a cornerstone, I think, for all of us as investors. It's also, we believe, a cornerstone of the industry. We think that the regulatory process, there's been a lot of discussion around how slow that's gone in certain jurisdictions. We actually find that to be really an important step in how this industry is going to be built. And so going slow and doing it right, I think, is one of the key places to begin. But I think that David and I are here looking at Africa because it is one of those economies that is really just emerging now as a player in cannabis. And so it's great to have Sibs here with your experience, both advising companies and being a consultant on the ground, to really kind of understand how cannabis as an impact industry can affect Africa. And then we can talk about some of the challenges about how we go about enacting that. But first of all, I thought you told me a really interesting anecdote. One of the things we face in the US and North American markets is the challenge between the unregulated and regulated market. People call it the black market, but it's really an unregulated open market. And given my experience in Latin America, that unregulated market is actually a really important part of the economy. And so when you think about the evolution of cannabis going into a regulated market, not leaving those players behind is critical. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about what's happening in Swaziland, what's happening in South Africa, Lesotho as well, and how that unregulated market is actually a cornerstone of the industry.
Thanks so much. So, to that point, and I think as many of you here are well aware, the black market in the African context is very much ingrained in the fabric of many societies, communities, particularly in the rural parts of the continent. Where I'm from in Swaziland, the village where I'm from, Hlosheni, cannabis farming is sort of where a lot of my, let's say, friends and sort of family members and associated sort of individuals, their entire education was funded through pretty much cannabis farming. And that's not the exception. I think we see that throughout the continent. I think for the sector to be a long-term winner in Africa, that segment of the economy cannot be ignored. And I think there has to be a lot of thought put into how do we bring those rural villages, that sort of supply chain into the formal cannabis economy. And I think there's a couple of ways in which that, or a couple of areas in which we can have some pretty sustainable businesses built, particularly around the recreational sector where, world-class international African brands can be developed that have a linkage to, for example, my village in Klosheni or a certain homestead in KZN or Lesotho, as well as cannabis tourism. I think that, the ability for, to generate hard currency by actually showing people what the story has been for decades in certain parts of the continent are two, real tangible opportunities that I think we can get right.
And so, as investors coming into this, and maybe actually this is a good chance just to hear from the audience so we keep the topics focused on what you guys care about, but how many of you in the audience are operators? People raising money? And then how many of you are investors looking to deploy capital? And then how many of you are either a mix of the two or maybe service professionals looking to somehow touch the industry, help the industry grow? Interesting. So I think as investors coming in, and David, I'd love to hear your perspective. Again, we have vilified the unregulated market as a negative in the industry, and I think that the economic pressures that we've seen in the US anyway, that taxation and difficult regulation, certainly in California, has only allowed the unregulated market to flourish, and not necessarily in a good way. But when we come in as investors, we, as especially impact-oriented investors, want to be sensitive that that is such a critical underpinning of key economies. So how do you, David, think about coming into the space, trying to find the target companies, and maybe, Sibs, you can talk about this as well. How do you qualify teams that either have started in the unregulated markets and want to get access to the regulated markets? Are they targets for investment, or are you looking for more formal folks coming from normal industry or non-cannabis industry into cannabis?
So you bring up a great point. We have several of our early portfolio companies based in California. And certainly the taxation and proposed new tax on the cannabis industry is really a burden that many in our industry cannot bear. For us as investors, it highlights the importance to be patient and to be there for additional support while they're going through these changes. But that's why we're here. We're looking beyond California. We're looking, and sometimes that's a challenge in of itself, is breaking down the opportunities. But certainly, that's what we're looking well beyond the U.S. Because right now, while they're trying to figure things out, it's a perfect time to look elsewhere and see where the opportunity is out here.
Indeed. And Sibs, with your advisory and consultancy business, I'm sure you've seen the entire gamut of different players. Plus, there have been foreign investors, not just folks like us that are coming with capital, but already have full international operating companies, the Canopies, the Auroras of the world. So when you think about segmenting the market or trying to pick targets, how does that work on the ground?
I think one of the sort of major challenges, as you mentioned, we come across a whole host of different entrepreneurs, management teams who are very enthusiastic about entering the sector. But we, first and foremost, have a strong focus on team. So the first, the team is the make or break of whether the company is going to make it and whether the necessary skill sets are within the executive, of the founders. And also, a team is not necessarily, it's not hard and set. I think the self-awareness to say, hey, we've got a great finance person, we've got a great execution person, but we just don't have someone who is global in terms of helping us understand, how we can form JVs and so forth. Sometimes just that awareness of trying to understand where the blind spots are and how exactly the sort of the final product will look with the right individuals in place. I think that's something that sort of is front and center. Number two, and to the point of sort of impact and connection to the community, we think there's a big gap between black market participants who have built up these robust businesses and who've got, who've used this product for good intentions in terms of giving back to their communities and capital. And there's a massive gap there. So quite often the individuals that have the, let's say, the foresight to see this opportunity, they're not necessarily the rural growers or communities that have depended on this plant for a long time. And so we actually we work with the whole spectrum of entrepreneurs and management teams, but also make a concerted effort to actually get into communities, to actually understand what's happening on the ground in Swaziland, for example, where I'm from, in Eastern Cape, in KwaZulu-Natal. And as our platform grows and evolves, we'll hopefully be in a position to help get those into viable brands and businesses, alongside those who who've got a lot of the expertise, industry experience from other sectors, capital, and so forth. So we want to sort of ensure that the growth of the sector is inclusive and really far-reaching across, let's say, Southern Africa initially.
And in that exchange, David, you said patience, and Sibs, you mentioned capital. So the pump and dump ideas, the green rush, the spike in public market valuations, which now have come way off, that's obviously one phase of a new and robust economy that cannabis promises. But when you think about the patience element, David, and maybe it's the capital sourcing element here, where do these companies, if you've identified the team, if you said, okay, I've done the entire boil the ocean strategy, I found the 5 guys that are great, how do you get the capital to meet them? And does that come from overseas, like us coming in and being interested, or is there a sort of a vibrant, robust market here locally to source capital as well?
Sure. So that's I think that's what keeps everyone, a lot of these entrepreneurs up at night, including myself, in the way of capital to really get businesses off the ground. So we sort of have, let's say, a long, medium, and short-term approach to capital. In the long run, we do think that as the industry develops and sort of strong case studies from across the globe become front and center, showing the scale of the sector and the ability to really move the needle in terms of employment creation and so forth, we think that the local institutional investors are going to be the largest contributors of capital into the sector. So that's all your pension funds, your asset managers, your family offices. And the medium, let's say the medium term, the capital that'll be attracted to the sector is more so sort of high net worth individuals. It'll be your smaller size family offices, where I think you can, through an educational process of and relationship building process, that capital, I think, starts to open up at a local level. In the short run, I think there's definitely much more of a focus on sort of high net worth, so other entrepreneurs who've sort of sold companies and who are looking for the next, the next industry to invest in, and also crowdfunding in a sense. So that's one area that we've been doing a bit of work and research on, trying to create a model or platform where for the companies, some of the companies that we've worked with, and we're confident, that they've got the sort of required mix of ingredients to set up a successful company. We'd like to introduce a crowdfunding platform that will allow individuals to invest companies that we've vetted. I think the African sort of local investment pool is a challenging one to mobilize for a number of reasons. First and foremost, local returns have been very, very difficult. Anyone who's in the stock market in South Africa knows the kind of headache that investment managers are going through. Number two, I think culturally, even in the startup world, investors in sort of, let's say, Southern Africa generally have a more of a private equity sort of lens when they look at opportunities, and not a venture capital sort of lens, or even impact investing. And so, you generally will struggle to get money for a startup. And so that means that the requirement of, having your ducks in a row is that much higher for the cannabis sector. Hence why I say more so in the long term, I think that pool of capital will become available.
And David, maybe you can speak for both of us. Coming in from the outside, we might have patience, but we might not have the best eyes coming into this. So how important is the local partner, and how would you go about working with the local community to source those deals and then to watch those deals in your portfolio as they grow?
One of my main goals coming out down to South Africa was exactly that. For me to think that I'm going to be able to understand the opportunities, understand the politics, ridiculous, right? So the same way I don't expect anyone outside of US to be paying as much attention as we are. And that's the reason we're here. We're here to find partners. We're here to link up. Sibs and others encourage you to come up to us after and over the next 2 days. And that's really what iCAN is about. That's what the cannabis community is about. And without that type of global collaboration, we're not going to succeed as an industry. And so first and foremost, that's what we're here to do.
I completely agree. So if we opened with, on the opportunity side, impact as being one of those areas, clearly I mentioned kind of the rise and fall of the stock market, which hopefully will rise again as it relates to cannabis. Clearly one of the main opportunities and why we're all here is the returns. But you don't get returns without getting out. So if you understand the regulatory environment, you're looking at an unregulated market and a regulated market, you're trying to be inclusive and include all players, bring the entire economy along, because again, I'll just underscore this, if you leave it out, you're not only hurting the local economy, but you're hurting the entire industry. The power and knowledge that comes out of these unregulated markets or informal markets is critical to the long-term health of these emerging economies. But if you are able to go through that environment, feel comfortable, you find the right teams, you found a local partner, you finally found the company and you invest, how long do you stay in? And how do you get out? Especially if you're here, not only in South Africa, but you are in the north of the continent or in a non-sort of headline-oriented country.
So the exits sort of question and let's say the mindset of the investors that are coming into the sector, I think is a massive one. And I think we sort of, in the Africa private equity space, this is sort of the, let's say the key topic that's sort of, got the skeptics, really, expressing concerns around investing in Africa, because where are you going to sell your company and what will that look like? So I think, first and foremost, the importance of the type of investor that comes on board for any given company cannot be stressed enough. Some investors, might be willing to write you $1 million check, $5 million check, but in their heads, it's a 1-2 year play. You need to, they want to have a return, they want to be out. Other investors with a longer term perspective, with an impact lens, and with patience, as we've touched on a few times, those kind of investors will enable you to optimize for the long-term success of your company and of your operation. So I think not every dollar is the same, and not every dollar will result in the desired outcome. And so I think that's sort of first and foremost to stress. Number two, what we've seen in the North American markets with the recent correction has to some degree changed the psychology of a lot of international investors in the space. When, I think now there's a shift towards building and getting to sustainability, getting to a business that's profitable, that's cash flow generative, instead of just looking to expand across the globe. It's bittersweet, I think, for the Africa chapter, because it means that local players have got a little bit of breathing room now to actually set up a sort of Africa focus, or even companies that are looking to export while the rest of the world is getting their houses in order. And as if the industry is going the way that we think it's going to go, then I think a big source of exits will be international companies further down the line saying, we've got everything on track in Canada and Europe. What's happening in the African context? And these 10, 15 companies are top tier. They've built solid foundations, and we'd like to be involved in that. And so I think that's a source of sort of exit, one avenue. Secondly, I think as companies in other sectors shift and think about their cannabis strategies, they are also looking to potentially look at very interesting acquisition targets, and I think also in the African context. So I think that's potentially another source as well.
Yeah, and again, the exit market it's obvious in many ways, but it's also so important to think about the recirculation of capital, because you can't. We see this right now in the U.S. markets. Great companies, but they went out to raise capital, but only on a short-term basis, so 6 months to a year, rather than thinking about 24 months plus. And they can be fantastic companies on great teams, great growth trajectories, but if there is no recirculation of the private equity market, which is very small, reasonably small compared to other markets in the U.S., that capital is trapped in those companies, and there's not a lot of fresh capital coming, at least in the near term. So maybe one of the lessons for the operators in the room is to, one, think that you're bringing in a partner, and so the decisions that you have going forward once that capital's in is a joint decision. And then two, that you might want to think about how you talk about valuation and ownership, because having enough cash in your balance sheet to make sure that you weather the storms, especially, I mean, I assume that the windows in Africa, as far as opening and closing for access to liquidity, are probably even fewer and further in between than perhaps in North America. So maybe that's a lesson for everyone to take away. We have just under 9 minutes left in the time, so why don't we, unless we have anything else to add, open it up to the audience for questions or comments?
My name is Wayne Siegel. I'm a strategic advisor to two international medical pharmaceutical companies. Also invest in medical cannabis businesses. And I just wanted to ask you, for companies that are more R&D based or that are more brownfields, not greenfields, but they've got IP and development assets and human capital, on what basis would you look at a fair valuation? What sort of, there's no PE basis for valuation, so how do you go about that? What is fair? What is an industry standard? Yeah, just your views on that. As opposed to obviously existing companies with revenue streams. And then even then, there's still hybrids between companies that have R&D underway, that they're still launching into the market in the form of new product oil and existing revenue. So it's quite a tricky sort of area, if you could clarify that. Thank you.
So I'd love to hear also the overlay from the region. So going back to my background, prior to being an investor, I was a banker in healthcare. And when you're looking at an IP portfolio or a biotechnology pipeline, you're really making guesses at what the price of whatever your product is going to derive in future revenues. So you don't have revenues today, you're not going to have revenues in the near term. If you have revenues, you're not going to have any sort of cash flow or profitability to do a valuation off of. So typically, if you look at the research models, which is probably the best place to start, so if you're an IP-based company, look at IP public companies. If you're biotech, look at public biotech companies. The research analysts typically look at DCF as one way of valuing a business or portfolio. As an investor, I, right now, am much more of a generalist. And so I am looking at businesses that I can value from a cash flow and revenue perspective. I find that IP portfolios and biotech portfolios specifically really require domain expertise. And so we find it very difficult to have one company in our portfolio be a biotech company. But if we had a portfolio of 10 biotech companies, there's a way of clustering around that. And so if you think about those companies as they relate to Africa, what else do you lay on top of that approach, or do you take a different approach to how you make those valuation adjustments?
I think great question. And I think particularly for the I think African market, you know, the sort of R&D and sort of patented formulae and so forth is one area that I think doesn't get enough attention, funding, focus, because you know, I think they in the way of sort of the, let's say, the black recreational market, and even some applications on the traditional medicine side, you know, there's some local solutions which have got great implications on medicinal wellness and so forth, and so it's kind of a great focal area. From our perspective, you know, when I think about sort of sort of market sizing there, it all kind of, I think, boils down to the total addressable market eventually. So how big is the total addressable market for for your IP? What are some of the risks associated with being able to get to market, and what probability do you place on those risks? How well how much protection can you actually give your your IP from a legal perspective? Is there an ability to sort of do you have enough resources to push back should there be a challenge? And so all of those elements, sort of go I guess towards building your model, your discounted cash flow model, for example. But I do think that just kind of going back to the sort of foundation of that question is that a lot more sort of resources need to be put into identifying local IP and really sort of branding it and selling it to the world.
David,
It's a case-by-case basis. It's a great question. I think it's not just R&D, it's valuations in general. I think we're seeing, which we've identified, a lot of correction on those valuations in the past 6 months or so across the board, and so certainly it's going to affect R&D. You took the words from my mind. It's going to be total addressable market and IP, how best you're able to protect your IP. And for that, we're going to certainly lean on, depending on where that R&D is. If it's out here, we're going to depend on really lean on our advisors. Where that total addressable market is, both within that region, and then we look to other partners outside those regions. How best distribution is set up for when you take your product to market. Ultimately, there's no one right answer for that question, and so I would go to multiple sources for that. Don't just take one valuation and run with that.
Great. Maybe time for one last question.
Ronnie from iCAN. So looking at the North American experience, what would you want to make sure is not repeated in Africa? And also, I come from Australia originally, these sort of early stages. Like, what are those lessons that you don't want to have to repeat?
Very, very good question. And yeah, we think about that a lot. From my perspective, I think the one area that I'd like the African cannabis story not to repeat from North America is around the experience that the retail investor has had. So I think a lot of because of the nature of the industry and how new it is, a lot of the stock that's currently that has been sold through IPOs and has effectively been retail investors investing in those shares. And there's been massive losses that individuals have had who've bought into the promise of the sector. There's been some criticism from let's say the investment sort of banking advisory world that some of these projections were oversold and not really scrutinized enough. And so from an African perspective, what it will be very, very critical as the sector grows, because I think in the African context, almost everyone knows someone who's involved in this sector from a grassroots level, and someone who's passionate about the plant. And so people will be willing to let go of 100 Rand or 200 Rand or 500 Rand to support the growth of the sector. And I think us as individuals who are working with the entrepreneurs and the management teams, we have to add a protection for the man on the street who wants to be part of the story in terms of their financial future and so forth. And so one of the sort of reasons why ACA Group was set up is for robustness and thoroughness, and really trying to make sure that the companies that we back or that we work with, we have confidence that they're doing the right thing, they're being honest, and hopefully are going to be the winners in the sector.
I would add, maybe this is not what was wrong in the North American markets, but more of a wish list for Africa. We didn't really touch, we've been almost speaking without naming it about medical cannabis rather than CBD or hemp. But one of the really interesting points that when we were talking a couple days ago that Sibs brought up is that there's a large ag opportunity for the African Development Bank to invest into the continent. And coming out of my background, IFC World Bank and a bunch of the European development banks were our investors in Central America, the stigma of cannabis really still carries forward and over into hemp. So maybe my wish list of what not to do in North America is, let's go for the education side, but starting at the top down. Let's work with ministers and heads of government to break down the stigma of what the plant is, because I think that opens the doorways for capital. And then I think that because there are these really well-funded groups that are multilateral investors, having that capital available, maybe not, the bridge is maybe too far to go to medical cannabis, but at least for hemp. Because what we see as cannabis as an economic opportunity, it's a plant that literally grows anywhere. And if you can push those economics out to rural communities, to small farmers, there is a wave of impact that we haven't even begun to imagine. And so the wish list would be to bring in those development dollars, to take away the stigma, and then to be very thoughtful about how you move forward to develop this industry, because slow is actually not a bad thing.
I would add, we're not just growing cannabis for the sake of growing cannabis. Personally, we all have our reason for being here in this room today. I'm a two-time cancer survivor. Other than being an investor, for me, it's very important to further the legitimacy and the credibility of this plant, number one, and number two, which is really, really what I want to say is, which is to thank iCAN and CannaTech for putting this on today. Here we're at, I think this is, we're wrapping this up today. But to thank them.
Great slate of speakers, thank you all.
And to really utilize, they've been doing clinical trials in Israel since the 90s. No one's done more clinical trials than Israelis. Many of those have spoken at CannaTech events and will speak at future CannaTech events. I think what some have done well in Canada, to answer that question, has been able to pair up some of that data to what they're actually doing. Others haven't. They're growing for the sake of growing and sending to wherever they're sending without mentioning any names. Some are getting that sent back to them. So a little bit more purpose, a little bit more collaboration with those that have really been doing the research, I think would be beneficial. And I believe that will happen here with Africa. And I think CannaTech coming here leads that path. So thank you.
Well said.
Thank you so much, guys.